Influence of multi-microphone signal enhancement algorithms on the acoustics and detectability of angular and radial source movements. Scholes. Micha Lundbeck, Laura Hartog, Giso Grimm, Volker Hohmann, Lars Bramsløw, Tobias NeherFirst, published June 14, 2018. Research article. DOI.org web link. Article information. Open Access Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial 4.0 License. Abstract. Hearing-impaired listeners are known to have difficulties not only with understanding speech and noise but also with judging source distance and movement, and these deficits are related to perceived handicap. It is possible that the perception of spatially dynamic sounds can be improved with hearing aids, HAs, but so far this has not been investigated. In a previous study, older hearing-impaired listeners showed poorer detectability for virtual left-right, angular, and near-far, radial, source movements due to lateral interfering sounds and reverberation, respectively. In the current study, potential ways of improving these deficits with HAs were explored. Using stimuli very similar to before, detailed acoustic analyses were carried out to examine the influence of different algorithms for suppressing noise and reverberation on the acoustic cues previously shown to be associated with source movement detectability. For an algorithm that combined unilateral directional microphones with binaural coherence-based noise reduction, and for a bilateral beamformer with binaural cue preservation, movement-induced changes in spectral coloration, signal-to-noise ratio, and direct-to-reverberant energy ratio were greater compared with no HA processing. To evaluate these two algorithms perceptually, aided measurements of angular and radial source movement detectability were performed with 20 older hearing-impaired listeners. The analyses showed that, in the presence of concurrent interfering sounds and reverberation, the bilateral beamformer could restore source movement detectability in both spatial dimensions, whereas the other algorithm only improved detectability in the near-far dimension. Together, these results provide a basis for improving the detectability of spatially dynamic sounds with HAs. Keywords: auditory movement perception, hearing loss, minimum audible movement angle, distance perception, hearing aid signal processing. Introduction. Hearing-impaired listeners are known to exhibit considerable difficulties in complex environments relative to normal hearing peers. For example, in situations where multiple talkers are present, their ability to understand speech deteriorates more dramatically compared with quiet conditions. Dirks, Morgan, and Dubno, 1982, Plomp, 1978. Thus, hearing-impaired listeners require a better signal-to-noise ratio, SNR, to achieve a performance similar to that of normal hearing listeners. Plomp, 1986. Hearing aids, HAs, can help by restoring audibility and by improving the SNR. This can improve speech reception in noise, but it may also compromise spatial hearing abilities such as movement perception, for example, Carlisle and Lung, 2016. Together with source distance judgments, for example, Aykroyd, Gatehouse, and Blaschke, 2007, the perception of source movement has been found to be difficult for hearing-impaired listeners, which in turn has been related to the experience of handicap. Gatehouse and Noble, 2004. Although bilateral HA fittings can provide some benefit in complex situations compared with unaided listening, research has shown that there clearly is room for further improvement. Noble and Gatehouse, 2006. Therefore, the identification of possible avenues for improving these abilities by studying the effects of HA signal processing on the perception of spatial dynamics is a worthwhile goal. Despite this, research into the spatial hearing abilities of hearing-impaired listeners has been largely restricted to localization and discrimination performance in relatively simple acoustic scenarios. In realistic environments, sound sources and listeners typically both move around, but so far hardly any research into motion perception with hearing impairment has been carried out. One exception is the study of Grimm and Aykroyd, 2014, who found that for both normal hearing and hearing-impaired listeners, detection thresholds for self-motion, that is, rotations of the head, were smaller than for source motion, suggesting more accurate spatial hearing abilities with self-motion cues. In a recent study, we investigated sensitivity to angular and radial source movements as a function of acoustic complexity with young normal hearing, YNH, and older hearing-impaired, OHI, listeners, Lundbeck, Grimm, Hohmann, Lajson, and Neher, 2017. That is, we used virtual acoustics to simulate complex sound scenarios with a moving target source and multiple static interferers. The YNH listeners were only slightly affected by the number of concurrent sound sources in the left-right, LR, dimension and did not show poorer performance in the near-far, NF, dimension when reverberation was added. For the linearly aided, OA listeners, we found that concurrent interfering sounds impaired the detectability of LR source movements, and reverberation that of NF source movements. The results from our previous study raise the question of how to compensate these deficits with HA signal processing. Over the past decades, researchers have studied LR localization performance in static auditory space for listeners with hearing loss with or without HAs. In a recent review chapter, Aykroyd and Whitmer, 2016, summarized several studies investigating different types of aided performance in LR localization tasks. For example, Gzer et al. 2006, Gzer, O'Brien, Hain, McClelland, and Yiend, 2009, Piku, Aspel, and Ricketts, 2014, and Van den Bogert, Clayson, Moonen, Van Dun, and Wouters, 2006, all investigated different HA features including directional microphone settings in terms of their influence on the sound localization performance of hearing-impaired listeners. While Gzer et al. 2006, found that there was scope for improving the localization performance of hearing-impaired listeners, the other studies indicated minimal effects of directional microphones. In contrast to most other research on spatial hearing with HAs, Best, Micha, Freeston, Van Hoezel, and Dillon, 2015, recently addressed the performance of bilateral beamformers in static and dynamic multi-talker environments. They found that, relative to conventional directional microphones, the tested beamformer algorithms were generally superior for speech perception and LR localization in noise involving fixed frontal targets but not for situations involving head movements. Neither source movement nor NF spatial perception were addressed in their study. The studies reviewed above have in common that they used static or pseudo-dynamic, that is, successive presentations of a target signal from different discrete locations, scenarios to investigate the influence of algorithms. So far, no systematic research appears to have been conducted into the effects of HAs on target source movement detection in the LR and NF dimension in the presence of interfering sounds and reverberation. In the current study, we therefore investigated the influence of different multimicrophone signal enhancement algorithms on source movement detection in acoustically complex situations. To that end, we used a higher-order ambisonics-based system for simulating complex sound scenes together with a computer simulation of bilateral multi-microphone HAs. The HAs were configured to process the input signals in different ways. More specifically, the algorithms that we chose suppressed sound coming from non-frontal directions and furthermore attenuated spatially diffuse sound components such as reverberation. Reverberant sound is known to enhance auditory distance perception, but it can also degrade localization performance, Velaimaki et al., 2012. In our previous study, we found that OA listeners were negatively affected by reverberation in terms of their ability to perform a source movement detection task. In addition, we found that monaural spectral changes clearly increased as a result of source movements. On the basis of these findings, we started the current study with a detailed acoustic analysis to investigate changes in acoustical parameters that we previously had found to be related to source movement perception, changes in monaural spectral information, direct-to-reverberant energy ratio, DRR, as well as SNR. In doing so, our aim was to find out whether the chosen algorithms would alter these measures in a way that could be beneficial for HA users in a source movement detection task. We then evaluated the most promising algorithms in a listening test to explore the potential for improving source movement detection with HAs. In summary, the current study had the following aims: to acoustically evaluate various signal enhancement algorithms in terms of their ability to enhance acoustic cues that have previously been shown to be associated with LR and NF source movement detection. To evaluate the most promising algorithms for improving LR and NF source movement detection with a group of OA listeners.